Thank you, and thank you for the introduction earlier. I very much appreciate that and appreciate the opportunity to be here, though I always feel a little uncomfortable when I visit the campus as a Michigan State alumnus. I feel a little awkward. I wonder if something bad's going to happen to me here. So I had nothing to do with anything that happened in football last year. I won't even go there today. So appreciate the opportunity, and my talk's going to be really quite different. I am going to talk a little bit about engagement and no financial relationships to disclose. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the chaos of trying to conduct community engagement in the context of big data research. And I just love this figure, so I had to put it up there. I'm not going to spend any time on this either, but it just really is a wonderful graphic there. So I'm going to talk about a question that is, I think, going to be a critical one as these large data sets continue to be created and inform the ways in which we deliver care in large academic health centers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a good steward of the kinds of data sets that are being created. And in that context, I think some element of that answer to that question is going to have to include a commitment to trying to engage members of our local communities in dialogue about appropriate use of those data sets. And here, in this regard, I think there's a lot of lessons that we might learn from experiences that have been established in the context of large DNA biobanks. And what I'm hoping to do in my remarks is to say a little bit about the kinds of engagement activities that we've structured at the Mayo Clinic, because I do think that there are several shared common challenges that you see in structuring community engagement in that setting that can inform the way in which we reach out to communities in the context of these large data sets. And I want to be candid at the outset that I think there are some shared lessons here, but I also think that there's a number of cautionary points. And I want to conclude on a couple of those cautionary points because I do think that the challenges here may not be resolvable. They might not be easy to answer at all. So let me start with a little bit of history about our biobank at Mayo Clinic. We have had a biobank in place now for roughly 7 years. Eligibility for our biobank is limited only to adult patients. They have to be established at Mayo Clinic, live in the United States, and able to provide informed consent. The vast majority of them are English speaking in some manner or another, but we do have individuals that may have more limited English proficiency. They're asked to provide consent in writing. They generally do this by mail. In the earliest stages of our biobank, we approached people individually and we're doing an in-person consent. The feedback we received was that this was a large waste of time from participants that were being enrolled. They wondered, why do I have to schedule a separate appointment and come in to talk with someone about this project? Can I do this by mail? We then shifted over and then began to do informed consent through that process. They complete a very detailed health survey. This typically takes them approximately an hour to do, so this is a very detailed set of information we collect from them. They then provide, I believe it is now 6 separate tubes of blood using different anticoagulation methods and so forth that let us utilize those biological materials for a range of different types of studies. And very important for this discussion, they give us permission to go back into their health records and to pull information from their health record, combine it with the samples that they've donated for the purpose of doing medical research. We do provide an option for future contacts, and many investigators ask permission from us to contact those individuals. The biobank then reaches out on behalf of the investigator, so no one gets that information directly until a participant essentially consents into that secondary study that's being done. We also then follow up with them periodically and collect additional data. So in many ways, you can see here elements of a learning health system in a small scale reflected in the project that we have here. As of the end of June of this year, we have approximately 55,000 people who've enrolled in the biobank. The gap here is that many of them have consented but not yet completed either the phlebotomy or the survey associated with the work. Many of those individuals are older individuals that have been established patients at Mayo Clinic for some time. And in terms of the national dispersion of our sample, as you might imagine, many of these folks are coming from the upper Midwest, shown in the darkened colors here, but our catchment area is actually a national catchment at Mayo Clinic, and so we do include large numbers of patients that are coming from other parts of the country as well. The individuals, as I mentioned, are often established patients, and in terms of the overall length of the electronic health record associated with these patients, the median is well over 15 years. And so this becomes an incredibly useful resource for us as we're thinking about the kinds of medical studies that would be enabled by this. If we want to know about the status of women who've had breast cancer, but their primary cancer was 10 years ago, we can actually identify a cohort of individuals like that without having to essentially screen very large numbers of individuals. And I think we've tried to take advantage of that aspect of our biobank and the studies that we focused on. So in the context of a large collection like this, established over many years, there are several challenges I want to mention that I think are especially apt here. One of which has to do with the practicality of structuring community engagement. So if you think about that map that I just showed a moment ago, if we wanted to organize a group of individuals to come together and talk about a new research study that's being done, how would we do that? Right? We have people from all over the country. We could surely structure some sort of online process for that, but that's not going to create the kind of dynamic that we normally think of when we're talking about a robust community engagement process that might involve dialogue and extended interactions and people learning about that research study and providing an informed perspective back to us. So I think as these collections become larger and larger, the challenges of structuring engagement become more difficult. How do we engage these folks not just over time, but over large geographic distance? And lastly, there's the challenge of scope of consent, something that I know the afternoon panel is going to talk a little bit about. But in the context of our biobank, we really had to ask this question: how do we deal with the issue of the specificity of the permissions that we're seeking, when a part of the permission that we were seeking was ongoing access to their electronic health record? So if I say today, I'm okay giving you a blood sample, I'm okay signing this consent form, and I recognize that you're going to pull out of my health record all sorts of information that might be relevant to a study that you're doing. And next year, I develop schizophrenia, and a condition that I might consider to be highly stigmatizing. That might completely change the way in which I might think about your access to my health record. If I were asked again a year from now, I might very well say no, because of the fact that now there's information in there that I'm more concerned about. So how do we manage the fact that it's not just our capacity to do research studies that's changing, it's not just our understanding of disease that's changing, but it's my condition as a participant in these collections that's changing as well. And situationally, my assessment of the risks and benefits of participation can change dramatically over time. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that, and there have been many things that have been proposed. There's been proposals that we go back and renew consent when we anticipate that there may be some controversy or some unanticipated risks. Proposals to make certain types of studies subject to a lower bar for consent and so forth. But what we did instead, recognizing this key tension between allowing individuals to enroll in these kinds of collections at large volume, right, knowing that you have to have a certain generic process here, but also wanting to protect them against the kinds of harms that I was just mentioning a moment ago, what we did is we established an oversight structure that involved community advisory boards. And so for us, we see our community advisory board network not as about identifying unmet community needs and trying to tailor the research we do to meeting those needs, but we see it as a governance structure, as an oversight or a stewardship mechanism. In addition, since many biobanks have been criticized or specific concerns have been raised about biobanks, we see this as a mechanism for addressing some of those specific concerns. So for example, is it appropriate to use materials in our collection for commercial purposes? That was something that we anticipated could come up, but initially we restricted the use of our materials only to Mayo Clinic investigators. Over time, as the collection has grown, we've had a number of overtures from companies who are interested in partnering with us. We were able to take that issue to our group of advisors and get input on that. In fact, in that setting, it required a great deal of education about how monies flow in the context of research studies. And what we did, among other things, was we asked them to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which allowed us to share the details of our budget at a very granular level with them, to share details of various business plans that had been proposed and various relationships that had been discussed in the context of specific companies. And so it is possible, I think, to use these kinds of advisory mechanisms to explore very complex and controversial issues once they're established. Other things that we've talked about had to do with data ownership and transfer of ownership to other entities, pooling those data into national collections, for example, and so forth. So with regard to how we think about ethical stewardship in the context of our biobank, we think minimally that any mechanism that's set up to sort of involve members of the community ought to consider how to minimize the risks associated with participation in these collections, how to ensure good alignment between the goals of the research that you're conducting and the intent of the individual sample donors. Similarly, alignment of community goals and interests with the work that we're facilitating, and promoting transparency with regard to sample usage. And this is probably, in my opinion, the area where there's the greatest amount of lesson to be learned for learning health systems, right? The controversies that have been associated with biological sample collections, the Henrietta Lacks story, the Havasupai controversy, and so forth, at the end of the day are controversies that are rooted in a lack of transparency, that a community or a family or an individual is finding out secondhand that materials that they donated with one intention in mind actually ended up being used for a very different purpose. And so I think that ethical stewardship demands a commitment to transparency, and that informed consent is a very poor mechanism for trying to achieve that particular goal. Instead, what we need to do is we need to structure these advisory networks, community engagement activities that better facilitate disclosure to communities. So let me just end with a couple quick comments related to our advisory board network. We've had an advisory board in Rochester, Minnesota now since 2010. That board meets 5 to 6 times per year. It's advised us on a whole variety of different topics, including some of the ones that I was just mentioning, but also including things like whether or not our collection should do whole genome sequencing on the 55,000 samples that we have. And if we did that, how would we make decisions about offering selective results back to those individuals? Our network is expanded now beyond Rochester to include groups in Florida and Arizona, where there's also large collection activities taking place. The group that meets in Arizona is actually connected to a federally qualified health center called Mountain Park Healthcare, and the majority of the patients that they serve in that context are Spanish-speaking individuals that receive their care in the context of this free clinic network. And so in that context, we have a very different set of concerns that are coming from the community, and our network is nicely positioned to be able to have that dialogue as well. I think there's lots of value. Again, I'm not going to go through this slide because I think most of the folks in this room would readily appreciate that. But if the challenge of sort of maintaining transparency is partly an educational one, one of the things that our advisory board really helps us with is finding creative ways to do education within the community so that more and more people locally are informed about the work that we're doing and ultimately have a more informed perspective on the potential value of that work. So lastly, 2 or 3 key lessons for this audience. First is that I think similar to the work that we've done, most people are not going to be familiar with the activities of a learning health system. They're going to be confused about boundaries between research and patient care activities, for example. These distinctions that we draw between quality improvement and clinical research are not going to be distinctions that are going to matter to most lay people. If they're morally important distinctions, we have to clarify for them why they're distinctions that matter. Communities are inherently pluralistic. When we talk about representation of individuals from the community on our board, we often struggle to flesh out what exactly does that mean. Is it traditional distinctions between racial and cultural communities that we may have in mind, or is there a different type of representation that comes into play in the context of clinical research activities? And then the challenge that I think, again, I've already alluded to is that engagement activities are usually done best in the context of local relationships. We get to know individuals within the community. We hear them. We interact with them. We share communities with them. We share living activities with them. Engagement, when it's done well, I think is a very highly localistic activity. But learning health systems are going to pool data across very large networks of providers, right? And those networks are going to themselves be pooled into additional collections. So your Ann Arbor collection becomes part of the University of Michigan catchment area, which becomes part of a large data mart that might exist at a national level, which might ultimately be part of an international collection of data. And so in that context, what does it mean to still do community engagement when the community is the global community? And it's that point, unfortunately, that I want to leave you with. It's a little bit cynical, but I do think that it highlights the ways in which, as we grow up the scale of these activities, how we think about community engagement has to change. And I believe it has to change in the direction of almost looking to political entities that might serve as the mediums through which we engage communities, where you have political representatives who are voted in, who are themselves identified members and spokespeople on behalf of individual communities through some political process. And in the clinical research world, we haven't necessarily thought about the complexities of that kind of representation of community leadership. So I'll leave you on that point. Thank you.